everyone. Thank you all for coming. I'm Nitzan Korev. I'm from the Sociology Department in the Watson Institute. And I'm extremely pleased to introduce Anne Swidler here. Anne is a cultural sociologist, as we all know. She's also a professor of the graduate school at the University of California-Berkeley. It's going to be a long list, but Swidler has been a Guggenheim Fellow, French-American Foundation Professor of American Civilization, Fellow of the Successful Societies Program of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, Visiting Scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation, and Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, among many other institutions, I'm sure. More importantly, maybe, she has done very, very influential work on culture as well as religion, including a landmark article, Culture in Action, probably one of the first sociology articles I've ever read, from 1986, and Organization Without Authority from 1980, as well as Talk of Love, that was extremely influential from 2001, and several important co-authored books, including Habits of the Art, The Good Society, and Inequality by Design. Her most newest book, with Susan Coates-Watkins, is A Fraud Embrace, The Romance and Reality of AIDS Altruism in Africa, from Princeton University Press from 2017, which explores the intersection of global and local responses to the AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. Her interest in institutions that create collective goods has led to her work on chiefs, religious congregations, and NGOs, and to the current project on social ecologies of religion in Malawi, which is what we're going to listen to today. Thank you so much for coming.
All right, thank you. So this is new research, and my joke here, which is only partially a joke, is that it is composed of 1 aspiration, 5 anecdotes, 3 suggestive hints, and a partridge in a pear tree. So, all right. Yeah, because it's new research, the ideas are much bigger than the data on which it rests, although I actually have a lot of data, I just haven't analyzed it yet or really read through all the interviews and whatnot. Okay, just for people who aren't at all familiar with Africa, there's where Malawi is, and it is a very, very poor, very densely populated, so it actually is relatively big by African standards, population around 19 million and growing all the time. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. This is its comparable per capita income is $1,200 a year per person if you consider what people grow, what they actually have. If you looked at cash income, it's probably in the order of $150 a person a year, I mean, what they actually could spend. And it's mostly rural, lots of subsistence farmers. It's not nearly as urbanized as most countries in Africa these days. And it's largely Christian, but about 20% Muslim. And I'll just say, like many places in Africa, religious affiliation is virtually 100%. You cannot find people, except I will show you one, but he's the exception that proves the rule. Okay, you can't find people who don't have deep religious affiliations. I started out, let me say, let me tell you what I wanted to do that I couldn't do, and then you'll see why I'm doing what I am doing and how I might get back to what I wanted to do. When I was studying how badly much of the important institutional life that big donors wanted to bring to Africa, how poorly it functioned, you can't be there and not realize, wait a minute, one reason these foreign-sponsored institutional forms don't take root in African societies is because they actually have institutions that function pretty well. And so they don't just throw over what is already working in favor of what you think is a superior form that works for you given your, or maybe it even doesn't work given how, you know, democracy based on voting and stuff can sort of throw things off anyway. But so what you notice is how totally committed people are to their church and how utterly indifferent they are to your NGO the minute the money stops flowing. And you notice how amazingly much authority local village heads have. I'm calling them chiefs, but there are a variety of levels and kinds. How amazingly much authority village heads have, even though legally speaking, They actually have none. They don't have any formal authority at all, and yet they are amazingly important in local life. So I decided for the second project not to look at what doesn't work, but in some sense to look at what does work, even if it doesn't work exactly in the ways that we might think look ideal in our fantasy life. So I originally had the idea, and you'll see how this fits into my sort of conceptual apparatus here, of either comparing or looking at social cooperation or something between chiefs, churches, and NGOs. And I thought, as you'll see, that they had different kinds of authority structures, and it'd be really interesting to know where they competed and where they cooperated. I tried to do interviews. I actually had been working on this over a number of years, doing a little bit here, some interviews with chiefs. And when I say do interviews, what I really mean is I hang out the way an anthropologist would, sort of chatting with people. I know a lot of villagers, actually, and so asking them about their chiefs and what they know and village gossip and so forth. And then you can get very inexpensively, extremely smart, well-trained local people who will do interviews for you for just tiny amounts of money. So I would get 10 interviews here, 10 interviews there. And they were basically useless. The chiefs, I learned some interesting things, but the chiefs would say, oh no, you know, we get along fine, everybody loves everybody, and the churches are wonderful, and the church people would say, oh no, we get along. I mean, it's just so bland, and I couldn't get any sense of how things actually happened. Finally, I got the idea for this project. And so now I will tell you how I'm approaching the study of religious ties and what I mean by the social ecology of religion. So first, I'm going to say a little about these competing models of authority, even though this is not the empirical thing I could focus on, but it's my ultimate. I said I had one aspiration. This is the aspiration. So the way chiefs, you could say in a very, very abstract way, from the point of view of villagers, the authority of their chief is involuntary in the sense that if you live in the village, you are trapped, basically, in this small community with a hierarchical authority over you, and you can escape that person's authority basically only by leaving the village. This is what Mahmoud Mamdani has written about. He's called it decentralized despotism. It's hierarchical, at least in the formal way it's understood, very much hierarchical. There's a lot of deference to chiefs. If you go to see one of the more senior ones, the traditional authority, you have to have freshly washed and pressed clothes. You have to bring a gift. You have to be very careful about what you say, and so on and so forth. So there's quite a bit of hierarchy. The way the chiefs actually function is that they do almost nothing without consensus. So they're very concerned to maintain harmony in their villages. They very rarely use their authority to punish anyone, and they're much more likely to resolve problems by deciding not to resolve and just postponing them. That's their favorite move. So they're very, very hesitant to abuse their authority. They really don't do it. But if you think about the way the sacred, which I think is fundamentally connected to the capacity for collective action, sort of, if sacredness kind of flows up, and it flows up the chiefly hierarchy, as do certain material benefits, and it is redistributed downward. So in the traditional understanding of religion, the work by anthropologists, you know, without the chief had to make the land fertile, make people fertile, make the community fertile. And actually the chief's own fertility is still, you basically cannot be an unmarried chief, because your personal fertility, your ability to marry and have offspring, is actually connected to the sacred, the sort of hidden aspects of your formal or informal role. Religious congregations model a different image of authority in the sense that they are the thing people choose. And that's what I'm especially interested in, that you're, in a sense, stuck in this village with all the same people. It's like being in a university department. Think of it that way. But your religious tie is something you choose freely. And it is absolutely evident that Malawians see it that way. That's how they behave. That's how they understand it. And in fact, what originally got me onto this was recognizing how often people are members of churches at considerable distance, or mosques from considerable distance from their own village. So the idea that there's a village, in that village's church, the villagers go to that church, no, they don't. They go somewhere else. And other people come to the church in their village. So in fact, not always, but many, many people. So these churches are creating a social ecology. They are creating essentially a two-level network in which the people are tied to villages beyond their own village by their religious affiliations, and the villages are tied by the connections of the people who live in them. And that is what I ultimately would love to be able, I might even get around to formally modeling this, although if you know me, you'll know that's highly unlikely to actually happen. And then the third, and the way, I'll just say more about churches, which is that although in fact often they are quite hierarchical, and actually I think many churches are more hierarchical in certain ways than many chieftaincies, they are imagined as freely chosen communities of equals who share the same blessings. And in fact, the way you're welcomed, for example, if you enter, just think about it, if you enter a village, the very first thing you have to do is go and be introduced to the chief. You have to sit with him. You have to wait. If he's not there, you have to wait until he's ready to talk to you. You have to offer a gift, and so on and so forth. There's a lot, and I do this. I mean, I said, I wait. I try to show, I don't know if I'm doing it correctly, but I try to show the right amount of deference and so forth. I have I guess I call her friend, research assistant anyway, who is enormously charming, and she got caught up. The chief wanted her to become his secretary, and so we had to sit through several chief's courts. Of very cool. Anyway, so she puts on the charm for me. And when you go to a church, first of all, you can just walk in, and then everyone will say, welcome, welcome, sister, welcome, welcome. And very often they'll embrace you and hug you at the end of the service, and there's a special part of the service where everyone greets everyone. So it has an egalitarian image, even when it isn't necessarily egalitarian, and the sacredness is located in the communal worship. And I say that not because, of course, sacredness is up there, but it is the moments of being totally carried away by the music, by the hymns, by speaking in tongues, by being transported in the midst of communal worship, where people actually experience the sacred entering them. So their relationship may be with Jesus, but the sacred moment is that moment of collectivity. And then the NGOs, just very briefly, since I'm not going to talk about them in this talk, but I like the kind of formal contrast that the NGOs really conceive the sacred to be embedded in autonomous individuals who are endowed with individual human rights. And so there isn't a collective sacredness, there is an absolutely individualized notion that, and so every baby has to be registered at birth, and every child has a right to, this literally is, you know, their childhood, and so on and so forth. These slogans that especially UNICEF is very, very enthralled with. And it's connected for local people to a global authoritativeness, and the sociologists will recognize sort of John Mayer and world society theory here. That actually is true on the ground. People experience themselves. They may be utterly uninterested in the thing that NGO is sort of selling, but the sense that being connected to that NGO connects you to some kind of global legitimacy. They understand that very, very clearly. And then the NGOs try to have formally democratic forms, but those don't happen. All right, and very, very briefly, I'll just say I think recent work on Africa is increasingly, there's also some work on Congo by James Robinson and others, increasingly showing, I won't go into any detail here, but showing that these informal networks that go across domains and across geographic spaces actually matter enormously in being able to get collective goods. So just as one example, Martha Wilfart has shown for Senegal that where village leaders and politicians are in areas that historically had centralized kingdoms, they are more likely, they literally get more schools, they get more wells, they get more health clinics. And they got it only after Senegal implemented decentralized local governance. So it's not that those areas are inherently richer or inherently have more pull with the central government. It's that when getting these collective goods depended on the ability to collaborate across villages and to prevent destructive inter-village competition, the regions that had had centralized kingships in which they see themselves as descendants of the same kingdom, those regions are able to create cross-village social cooperation because they literally see themselves as having dynastic ties that mediate relations between villages and that inhibit various kinds of self-dealing behavior. So I won't go into the other examples. Oh, oops. All right, now I'm going to get to the thing about which I actually do have some data, which is villagers, their religious affiliations, and once I started looking at these problems, you'll see that I ended up with the data I actually have are very, very rich religious autobiographies that look at where people have a religious affiliation, how far they go, where do they physically go, what do they get, where do they draw their friendships and so forth from. But I realized I had to also look at why and how often they changed denominations, or as they actually turn out to do, entire faith traditions. So people convert or change from being Muslim to Christian in the back, which I had not really understood. So how do villagers' membership in congregations create network ties among villages? How churches and mosques in both town and village connect people across communities? And then how churches and mosques interact with chiefs, politicians, and government to produce collective goods. The third thing is the thing about which I have no evidence at all, but a couple of tiny hints. Okay. And just the background of this would be that network ties, of course, can facilitate the exchange of information. So one reason to get out of your village and meet people from elsewhere and form ties of exchange and relationship is that they may know things you don't know, and pieces of information are incredibly valuable. What the prices of tomatoes are in some market far away from you, where the minibus stop might be, how to find a sexual partner or a spouse. All of these things are very, very, very valuable. But these ties might also moderate destructive conflicts. And I think the really important subtle part of this, and this is the thing that Martha Wilfart's work suggests very strongly, is that where there are certain kinds of ties, and we'd have to get better at specifying the ties, you are embarrassed to do things that would be seen by others as incompatible with your status. So chiefs are a lot more there are corrupt ones who are despised by everyone, who have terrible reputations, but in general, these cross-village ties, I think, maintain the status and reputation of local elites, of chiefs, of pastors, and without those status markers, they can't get the cooperation they need. And so I'll try to hint at how that becomes true and how that might facilitate the production of collective goods. And I'm mentioning here the wonderful work of Lily Tsai, who shows, I think, for Chinese villages that it's the ability, having an arena in which status can accrue to you if you do things that are good for the village as a whole. Makes an enormous difference in how effective village leadership is, whether it is elected or appointed. Makes no difference, and whether the region is rich or poor, actually. So I'm just saying, so far as I know, no one has actually looked at how religious affiliations might facilitate these sorts of ties. All right, now, getting a little bit closer to real data. Many Malawians joined congregations at a distance from their homes, and I actually know this because there was, in the large survey project, I was a fellow traveler, I think is the right term. I don't know how many people know that. term from the old communist days, but anyway, I was a fellow traveler of a big survey project in Malawi without ever being part of it. And it had a religion module, and so I actually know that many, many villagers travel as much as an hour or two to get to whatever congregation they are members of. And that people in the same town or village often join different congregations, that individuals change congregations, denominations, and even faith traditions, creating links among them, and that finally, individuals who move to a new place frequently use their religious affiliation to find a home in the place they move to. This is the kind of thing actually Max Weber described in his essay on the Protestant sects and the spirit of capitalism, describing the US in about 1911. You moved to a new town, and if you were a Baptist, you joined the local Baptist church, and your reputation came with you from your old congregation to your new one, and that appears to happen as well in Malawi. All right. I did almost all the interviews I did some in the town we were in a village I'm going to call Chirombo Village. And that turned out to be, I was hoping to do interviews in several small villages so I could look at all these interconnections, but the guy who set this up for me misunderstood what I wanted, and so he picked this very big village that also happened to be very religiously diverse. So it had about 1,000 individuals in 75 compounds. Many of the compounds, that is, these are family, essentially clan compounds, those themselves often religiously diverse. And this is just the beginning. I haven't listed every congregation of which someone was a member or had been a member. And there are literally tens of thousands of what you could call denominations in Malawi, both because Malawi was very fecund from the point of view of inventing its own churches. So, for example, there's something called the Abraham Church, which was developed by people who wanted to be Christians, but they also wanted to be polygynous. And so Abraham had, more than he had Hagar or whoever he had, and so why couldn't they have, more than one wife? And so this was the Abraham Church, and there are hundreds of these African independent churches, and then literally thousands of Pentecostal churches for which people need only profound spiritual inspiration. So one of my interviews is with a pastor who founds his own church, he has no training whatsoever, and he has a lot of trouble finding a name. He said, it's Bethel Church, Bethel, I've forgotten, the evangelical church right now. He said, but there's so many Bethel churches, I'm going to change the name next year like this. So there's no patent on names. So, all right, so individual religious histories jumble people's religious affiliations. And I want to tell you the story of Chief Chirombo himself. I didn't expect this at all, but it turns out he was born Muslim. He then, this common way people change religions, from a village, his end of the village is largely Muslim. There's a mosque right there. But his father died and his mother remarried. And his stepfather was a member of the Church of Christ, so she converted. So he was raised in Church of Christ. And his father was relatively successful, so he didn't live in the village. His father was actually a pilot on Lake Malawi, which was a ferry boat pilot, but that would be a formal job at all is a very good thing in Malawi, and this would have been quite a good job. And so he did that, and then he was actually from a part of the chiefly lineage, and when he was a young man, about 15, he was chosen to be chief. I asked him, I said, why did they choose you? He's very badly physically disabled, like very bad. I mean, one leg is completely withered, one arm completely withered, and so forth. Very intelligent man with, anyway, married, 8 kids, very impressive person. But that might be why. He said, I don't know. He said, you would have to ask my mother. And I said, have you asked her? He said, no. As if that were unthinkable. So I think his mother arranged this. All right, so he was in the Church of Christ. And then his brother-in-law said, you should try the Assemblies of God. This is a very big Pentecostal denomination in the US as well as in Malawi. And so it's one of the international denominations. And so he went there and he absolutely loved it. And he told us all about it, the speaking in tongues, and he sort of imitated how people moved their bodies when they spoke in tongues. And he was very enthusiastic about this. And so he went to the Assemblies of God. He thought that was absolutely terrific, and I guess much more exciting than his Church of Christ had been. And then it was too much for him to walk all that distance around. I don't think he could have walked, but take a bicycle or however he was getting to the Assemblies of God Church. It was too far away. And what was right there was the mosque. So he went back to being a Muslim. And seems totally devoted, completely. I asked, do you really know all the prayers and everything? Absolutely. He goes, he says he prays 5 times a day. I said, he said, but you can pray in your heart. So, all right, so he sees himself as a very good Muslim. And in fact, this will come up a little bit later, but he says that he won't allow anyone to live in his village who isn't religious. So he is extremely enthusiastic about being Muslim, and he's extremely enthusiastic about the idea that everyone should have some kind of church. Okay, another example is, from my research, is that a Catholic man marries into his Muslim wife's compound, so this area is not completely but largely matrilocal, and so he lives there with his wife and her sisters and their husbands and their many children, and I've actually visited and had a meal with them and so forth. But he was Catholic, and so he stays Catholic. His wife converts to Catholicism, and he tells me very proudly how far he walks every week to go to a Catholic church at some considerable distance from his village, which is itself about 45 minutes from the road, so getting anywhere from there is a major challenge. So that's just a very typical example of how you would get this sort of religious interconnection among villages. And then a third example, not uncommon at all, a woman said to me, and this was actually somebody I talked to, she spoke English. She said, well, I was born a Muslim, but when I fell ill, my Muslim friends didn't visit me, but the Christians did, so I became a Christian. And she joined the Assemblies of God because she, in essence, she preferred it. And I do think the Pentecostal denominations, which do a lot more in the way of healing and prophecy, they offer both, are growing at the expense of other. It's a very, very dynamic, extraordinarily dynamic religious environment. Okay, so then I'm arguing that institutional practices also create religious ecology. And what I mean by this is that not only are individuals often members of churches at a great distance from where they live that mix up who knows who and so forth, but the churches themselves invest quite a bit of effort, and the mosques actually, in exchanging, for instance, the praise team, which is the people who actually lead the singing and the prayers, will go visit a church of their same denomination, some 20 kilometers from their own place, and that church will send a praise team to there, so they exchange their youth groups. They're often a visiting pastor will come. And that pastor might come from Tanzania, but that pastor might come from somewhere not too far away. So and then it turns out that they also exchange essentially members of their executive committees who go elsewhere to see whether things are being done in a superior way compared to how their church does it. So there's a lot of attempt to exchange information, or in the case of the mosques, to see whether other places are doing things correctly. So this is both kind of like having an external review of your department. But what it means is that there are lots of institutional practices that lead to circulation among these congregations as a standard routine institutional way, not just at the level of individuals. Another practice that brings together people from different denominations in a common way where you can imagine they would talk about local problems, problems at the village level, problems at the community level, problems at the town level. I mean, you would have quite broad groups, are funerals. So funerals are a very big deal in most African societies. There's a staying all night with the body, there's an elaborate meal, there is a set of speeches that involve the chief and praise for the person, whatever was good about the person, explanations of why the person died, and so forth. So they're major, major events. They tend to be quite large. but the first one I went to was in Botswana. And I remember at the time, I didn't actually understand it then, noticing that there were 3 different clergymen from 3 different denominations. And they were very noticeable because they had somewhat different kinds of collars. They all were wearing black. But one was Lutheran, and one was Catholic, and one was Anglican. And they had very different kinds of crosses hung around their necks. And they each said some kind of prayers at the graveside. And I actually couldn't understand at the time why there would be, and there were about 200 people at the funeral, so men and women separate, wonderful singing and so forth. I was with a friend, and so I was asking her about some parts of it, but somehow I didn't ever ask about why these 3 clergy people were there. And then I came to understand from Jenny Trinitopoli, who did this religion project in Malawi, that if a village has several members from a pastor's congregation, that pastor will come and help officiate at the funeral, even if the person who died or the family of the person who died was a member of some other congregation. So you can easily get 3 or 4 or more pastors at the same funeral because they are there in some sense representing their congregants. And so there is a time for them to chat with each other. If they stay overnight for the funeral, there's lots of time to chat, to talk to the chief, to talk to local village influentials perhaps, and so forth. And so when I spent a lot of time with this chief because, well, he either liked me or he liked this woman I was with quite a bit. Not in a romantic way. He was definitely not flirting with her. He had a very nice wife. He was quite happy with the wife. But he liked having us around, so exactly why I maybe can't figure out. And so he wanted us to come back for his chief's court. And that was partly because he got her, my assistant person, he said his secretary was sick or something. So he got her, he trained her to take the proper kind of notes of the cases in his court. And then one day we went back and we couldn't have the court, so we had to come back again. Why? Because there was a funeral. So next time I saw him, I said, well, how was the funeral, and so on and so forth. And he had told me there was no sheikh in their mosque, that they had people who could lead prayers, but they didn't actually have a sheikh. And so, and the word sheikh is ambiguous there, so the head of a mosque, the official head is a sheikh, but a person who can lead prayers can also be referred to as a sheikh. So there's a little bit uncertainty. But I said, well, who actually officiated at the funeral? And he said, we had 37 sheikhs. And he said they came from all over. The other villages, far away, this and that. We had 37 sheikhs. All right, so again, in the context, I wasn't able to just say, wait, stop everything, halt the court. I want to know more about the 37 sheikhs. But I'll just say that the clear indication is that these are occasions when a very widespread group of people gets together and, has a long time in which they can confab with each other and with the pastors. All right, so that is a set of institutional practices. Now, these are the sort of hints. Why do chiefs want congregations? Because there's some potential for competition for authority. Who really, for instance, if a marriage is breaking down, is it the village counselors who monitor and try to resolve these issues? They're called unkosways. They're advisors, but they're really elder. They're usually an aunt in the family structure who is the official unkosway, but everybody has to have one. And, or 2, actually, you can have more than one. And does the chief have authority over this? Or you could imagine, does the pastor? Is he the one, or she, but most pastors men, is she the one or he the one who counsels the couple and tries to stabilize the marriage and tells them what they should do or not do? And we know that both these authorities actually do concern themselves with the marriages of their congregants. So you could imagine that and many other circumstances in which these groups would compete. So it's a little hard to understand why chiefs would welcome religion, or as Chief Chirombo did, insist that everyone in his village be a member of a church. Why? What's in it for him? So I began to understand this. It turns out the brother of a friend of mine is a pastor. I'm going to call him Blessings here. And he had gone through a spiritual transformation of his own, had joined something called the Calvary mission, or something that's a very, very big, probably major money-making enterprise in Malawi, and I think across several of the nearby African countries. He had joined that. It had transformed his life. He began to have more and more intense spiritual experiences. He actually rented a room that he could go to after work and spend 2 hours praying every day. So he had a private place where he could, intensify his spiritual commitment. And finally, he decided he wanted to found a church of his own. So he found a village that physically had no church in it. And he went to the chief. That's how you would found a church. You've got to get land. The land would come from a chief. So he went to the chief and asked for land to build the church. And I said to him, well, how did you persuade the chief? What did you offer him? And he said, I said, if my church comes to your village, you will have no more conflict and disagreement among the members. This will bring harmony to your village. And since chiefs really want harmony, that's a super important thing for them. Apparently that was persuasive. And then he said also, he told the chief he could bring development. Now, development is the code word for bringing resources from outside. Usually this is something NGOs do. And apparently he told the chief that he could do the same thing NGOs do. He could write proposals and things like that and maybe bring some resources in. And then I asked him, I said, well, is the chief happy with what you've done? And it turns out this guy has grown his church from the original 8 members. He went week after week, finally managed to recruit 8 people. He has grown it till now it has 300 members, largely from outside the village. So they go around and recruit people. So he's got all these hundreds of people who come to the village. And he spends all the resources he gets staging a couple of times a year crusades in which they go out and convert, or since there's nobody to convert, that is, there's nobody who's not religious. You're either converting Muslims or you're getting people to change churches. But at any rate, let's say these are like revival meetings in which people reaffirm their commitment to Christ and get spiritually and they morally restored. And this apparently has won over the chief completely. I don't think he's brought development. I don't know whether he's brought harmony, but he definitely has increased the positive reputation of the village. So that village, he told me with great pride, is known far and wide because of his church and its crusade. So again, this is built up, if you will, social capital, to use that horrible term, for this chief, who now knows that his village has a significant reputation elsewhere. Now I want to tell you a couple of stories, since this is the only chief I've really gotten to know well. At least I know some others from other years, but let's say in this project, since I've been interested in these things. And so this is Chief Chirombo, who first of all says no one can live there if he doesn't attend church. And that church is actually the word people use even when they mean church or mosque. Now, when I was at one of these chiefs' court, there were one issue that was resolved in a very formal way. Actually, it had to be postponed because the right people had to be there and everyone had to have their uncosways with them, and they didn't the first time, and it took forever to find out that nothing was going to happen. But there was another dispute that was not a formal case, so there was no plaintiff who paid a tiny fee to the chief to have the case heard. This was a case of a teenage boy who had stolen sweet potatoes from a woman's garden. And that woman was so incensed, she was there, and she was absolutely infuriated by this. This is what she survives on. This is not a garden in our sense. It's her farm. And this is what she lives on. And she was going to put herbal medicines around the edge of her garden so that if this boy came back, he would be killed by essentially the magic in these herbs. And this was a very, very threatening thing. The chief did not want it. Nobody wanted this boy to die from witchcraft. That would be a horrible thing, and it would lead to endless problems. So there was an attempt, many, many people participated. It was totally disorderly, relatives shouting from the back row, including an uncle who said, yes, he is a bad boy, he misbehaves all the time, he even stole something from me. And people shouting from different, it was amazing, in total contrast to the other cases I witnessed. It was really a sort of out of control, wild scene. At the end, somebody suggested that the problem was the children weren't disciplined enough. So by the time I came back, which was about 2 weeks later, the chief had declared that every child, every Muslim child, had to now go to madrasa so that they would behave properly. So I was actually sitting there, and at 3 o'clock he has a kind of town crier who goes down the path and shouts so people know if the health assistant has come to town or whatever, and this guy's shouting, and you see all these children running, including these little girls with their headscarves flowing behind them, running toward the mosque, because it's time for them to go to madrasa. So one way that the religious institutions serve the need for village, if you will, institutional capacity was that when things got rough, he wanted everyone to go to the madrasa. And actually, he also, during the same period, formally hired the sheikh who had been, it turns out, volunteering. They had a guy who had come from the large city, from Zomba. I don't know why he washed up there, but he did. He was an actual qualified sheikh. And he, the chief, then decided that they needed a sheikh, a paid sheikh. And so he taxed the Muslim villagers to provide a small stipend for that guy. So suddenly you have, you know, a formal sheikh who can actually run a little school, and you have the children. He's trying to improve their behavior. I asked him, by the way, I said, what about the Christian children? Do they? He said, no, they behave. He said, so, I don't know. He said, they behave, they go home to their families. And I think he was talking about that after church, people go home and read the Bible together as a family. And so he said, no, they behave, they sit together, they talk. So I couldn't penetrate that idea. But then I want to give you one more, just these are again these sort of straw in the wind type tidbits. So one of the cases I observed was a divorce, and a very long, complicated situation. But the long and short of it is that the wife, the man and woman lived there. The man was from another village that was quite far away, well over 10 kilometers. I got the sense even farther away. And he's the one who, the first time this case came up, he didn't have his Nkoswe with him, and so the whole thing had to be postponed. And he had come from very far. He had brought 3 of his relatives. He had dressed very carefully. He wanted to divorce his wife because, as he said, he's a good Muslim and he wants to take a second wife. And his wife that he had didn't want that and refused. So he was going to divorce her. The chief was very skeptical about this. He said, wait a minute. Then if you divorce her and you marry another wife, you'll still have only one wife. What is this with the 2 wives business? And it, in fact, kind of emerged without anybody really saying so, that he had a girlfriend, and he wanted to marry that girlfriend. And his wife was saying, no way, no how, no. Now, what was astounding about this is that the final resolution of this, after this failed attempt to resolve it, was that he forbade them to divorce. He said, you can divorce eventually, but you did not do this properly. You did not go through your Nkoswe. You didn't have that Nkoswe come to the village and properly discuss the problem with the Nkoswe in this village. You didn't do this, you didn't do that. And so until this can be done properly and everyone can agree, you have to come back and live in the village with your wife and your little boy. And I said to people, wait a minute. He's already moved away. He had already left the village. He was already living in this village, you know, I don't know, 10 or 12 kilometers away. I said, is he really going to come back here and live with the wife who's infuriated with him? I said, will they live together? Will she cook for him? Will they have sex together? People said, of course, absolutely, of course. I mean, the chief told him he has to come back. If he's married to her, he's going to eat the food she cooks, and he's going to have sex with her. That's what he was basically saying to me, what's the matter with you? You don't get this, it's very simple. what I couldn't get over is that the chief, whose authority is limited to his own village, has enough cooperation with whoever the chief is in that village the other guy comes from, that the guy clearly could not just go home and declare that he wasn't coming back. And he didn't care. He had come twice. I had seen him physically take a whole day off from work. He had a little business in town, bring himself, bring all his relatives, dress up. So it was clear to me that what this chief said, he does not have land in that village. That chief has, the chief Chirumbo did not, in my understanding of the world, have authority over him. So his ability to decide this case the way it did absolutely depends on the fact that he knows that guy's chief in the guy's home village will stand by whatever decision he makes. And that's the sense in which there is actually collective action that goes across the borders or boundaries of, yeah. All right. Now then, I don't have too much more. I do actually, but I'll try to keep it relatively short. Here I want to get into a really fascinating issue, which is the sense in which churches and mosques in Malawi, and this wouldn't apply to the West African Muslim places where there's a whole different, what Islam is just a different thing. But in the Southeast African context, the way mosques are connected to their congregants is really radically different. And this came up when we were interviewing the sheikh of the little town, the mosque in the town we were in. And at the end of the interview, I basically said to him, what's been the most surprisingly gratifying part of being a sheikh? And what's been the hardest, most disappointing? He said, they're the same thing, he said. My people respect me, but they don't love me. Now, what love means in this context is material support. So, and then we had a couple of Muslim interviewers and this friend of mine who had set the whole thing up as Muslim, and they started saying, yes, absolutely terrible, we don't support our sheikhs, we pay them almost nothing, and some of them are so poor. And this guy had emerged, he had no local business or local land, so he was getting barely enough to pay his rent and electricity. And he was really practically starving. And then this friend said, yes, my sheikh, who's in a different town, is so poor that he lives in a room in my house. So my friend is relatively well, he's not rich, but he's relatively well-to-do by local standards, quite well-educated. And so I said, how can that be? Why? He said, well, the people believe that the sheikh will be rewarded in the next life. And he shouldn't be rich, he should be poor, that's part of his sort of spiritual obligation, is to be poor. And it turned out that sheikh, it runs a madrasa, the mosque asked him to run a school. They charge the students in the school 2,000 kwacha a month, it's a little under $3, let's say. 2,000 kwacha a month for their children to go to the madrasa. And think about it, if your obligation is to say prayers in Arabic and say them correctly, and that's the core of your religious obligation, you have to go to enough madrasa to learn those prayers. You have to memorize them. It's a little like a Jewish kid in the US learning enough Hebrew to get through the bar bat mitzvah. You might not understand it, you might not like it, but you're going to get to that day and you're going to be able to recite your portion of the Torah in Hebrew. Well, they have to be able to recite these prayers properly in Arabic. And so they need to have a madrasa. So it turns out there were 100 children in this madrasa. The mosque was getting 200,000 kwacha a month. Again, not a huge amount. They paid the sheikh a salary of 45,000 kwacha. And the rest of that money, the other 155,000 kwacha, were used for the maintenance of the mosque. So he didn't get a dime, so to speak, more than what this minimum he was paid. Whereas the Protestants are constantly raising money, and even the Catholics have, they have days when they give gifts to their priests. Now, the Catholics do it much less. I believe the Anglicans and the missionary denominations do it a bit more, and the Pentecostal denominations do it way, way more. They are constantly raising enormous amounts of money for their pastors. And there's a pastor's welfare committee, there's pastor appreciation day. I've been there for these things. They bring, it's beautiful, they bring gifts for their pastors, the women swaying their hips, walking along kind of conga line. One has chickens, one has eggs, they have cabbages and tomatoes, they have onions. And then, as my friend said, very indignant about her Anglican church, said, yes, and they bring cookers. She said, how many cookers can he use? What does he do with all those cookers? One person brought him a refrigerator. So she was up in arms about this, but it did not, she still was a loyal member of her church. Okay, so I think one way to think about this is that in some sense, I'm going to skip ahead of where my slide is, to say that if the main religious connection you have is a sacramental one, that is, you are obliged to say certain prayers at certain times in the right way, you have to have a mosque. And you have to go to it at the appropriate times, depending on how strict you are. You have to go 5 times a day. During Ramadan, you have to go. You really have to go. We saw all our friends, everybody disappeared in the middle of the day to go to the mosque during Ramadan. But it doesn't matter which mosque. You can perform those ritual obligations without any connection to local congregation. And in fact, they are performed in such a way that it is unnecessary. You kneel, you say the right prayers, and you're done. And maybe some of the men stay afterward to chat, but there isn't really a congregational life that's a critical part of the service. And in fact, I had a wonderful undergraduate with me. I'll say she's of Asian descent. She's American, but she's of Asian descent. And so she went with the woman interviewer we had, who was Muslim, who brought her the right kind of headscarf and the right kind of long robe during Ramadan to go to the Eid al-Fitr prayers. And so she went, and we were, she had actually done a little bit of field work in a mosque in the US, but nonetheless, she was gonna, I felt, stand out like a sore thumb. Well, not at all. She went, she knelt, nobody spoke to her, nobody thought anything of it. She was dressed appropriately, she knelt appropriately, she left appropriately. Now, she and I visited many, many churches while we were there. We were always in the churches. Somebody would come sit next to us, somebody would bring a Bible to make sure she had her own Bible, but I didn't, to make sure I had a Bible to follow the service. Someone would often sit next to us to translate. We would be greeted before, greeted afterwards. We would be, again, welcomed, hugged. The experience totally different. So again, ritual obligation is, sacramental obligation is really key, I think. And if you think of the congregations as ranged from a more sacramental to a more, how can I put it, the spiritual qualities of the pastor can do an enormous amount for you by way of prophecy, by way of healing, by way of helping you succeed economically, by way of giving you hope when you have no hope. And you sort of range all the congregations, I think you can see that people would also pay less support to their particular sheikh. They don't need him, they just need a functioning mosque. Whereas by the time you get to the Pentecostal end, he's the one who actually has the power to heal you. He's the one who actually has power to bring blessing into your life. He's the one who has the power to correct your family life if it's out of sync. So I think the willingness to support these mosques and churches is related to where they fit on this sacramental versus what I'm calling congregational continuum. The mosques typically don't provide many services. They don't provide help when you're suddenly have an economic crisis. The welfare committees of the churches often can. They don't as often visit the sick in their own community. They're not as likely to know who is their own community. They're not congregational structures. This also, of course, has an economic dimension. Some of the mosques, most of the mosques are built by foreign money that comes via the Saudis, via the Muslim Association of Malawi. It used to come via the Libyans. The mosques all look the same because they all come from different fancy donors. Okay, now I'm going to buzz through a few interviews just because they're so fascinating. And this conveys the difference in tone in the way Christians versus Muslims talk about their religious affiliation. So this person is being asked, again, everyone was asked, you're in this church, have you ever changed churches? Have you ever thought about changing churches? Why are you in this one? And if they changed, they were asked for every change, why, and so forth. So this person had been in 3 different churches and finally ends up in Living Waters. Now, I think sometimes things happen for a purpose, because all along, though I have been going to churches, but I would not feel that I was praying. There was emptiness in my spirit, but when I decided to join Living Waters, there was a great change. And even before we had joined, we had heard of the wonderful things and so forth, and he claimed that his parents then said he was a new person when they saw him and they could see his life had been transformed, that the conflicts he was having with his wife were suddenly easier to resolve and so forth. Really life-transforming experience. The Muslim interviewer, very committed, the interviewer who actually was Muslim, the person interviewing him was Muslim, but I don't know if it was clear to him. One of our Muslim, I can't remember, one of our Muslim interviews has the first name Precious, which is a very, very common Malawian man's name. The other, Shamsi, would be recognizably Muslim. I think this was Precious. But do you ever think of changing your religion in the future? No, why? God said that the only religion which God recognizes is Islam. So why should I opt for another religion? That is, this is the right one. I don't need a spiritual experience. This is the correct one. And then he asks him a bunch of questions about which prayers he actually does and which ones he finds difficult to do and so forth. And all his answers are about the difficulties of doing the ritual correctly. So here is his answer to the question, why do you find it hard to pray 5 times a day? He said, the problem is that when you are going for prayers, just because it is time for prayers, you also need to consider where you are coming from before entering the mosque. And also, are you wearing the right clothes which are acceptable for time of prayer? So if he's dirty, if he's come from the fields, if he isn't dressed correctly, he would have to go home and put clean clothes on and then go to the mosque, wash his feet and hands and so forth. This is my favorite. This is my, so far, of the interviews I read, this guy is the be-all and end-all. Okay, here is a Christian, highly unusual, who is a member of no church. He quit his church in 2013. But why? So he is not a member of any church. He's refusing to go. And it's a much longer story, but he says he went to one of his friend's house. I used to be a Christian, but I stopped. And because I think it really should read, because I have a little education, at least I can read and understand some of the things. Yes, I found a Bible, King James Version, and when I opened the Bible in the New Testament, I found that it was written, the words are in English. So I had an interest, so I borrowed the Bible so that I could read it at home, and also I should go ask my pastor about this Bible, which was strange to me. So I went and asked my pastor. His answers were not convincing. He was just telling me, you are not reading this Bible with the help of the Holy Spirit. All what you are asking, it is the work of Satan, who is telling you to be asking these questions. You are not supposed to ask these questions. And when I went home, I was disappointed, and I decided that I should stop going to church, and if God will allow it, I may start again later. And then he goes on, and this interviewer was totally enthralled with this interview. So I can't read all of it, but if you can just glance at it, you will see. But the interviewer says, I want you to explain more details. You have all the time. I'm not in a hurry. So don't be brief, but give me all the details you wanted me to know. And then this guy launches, this goes on for pages. He can cite every Bible passage imaginable, and he's begun to think that Islam is closer to what he's reading in the Bible, because you shouldn't eat pork. The Muslims don't eat pork. You should wash yourself in certain ways. The Muslims do that. And so he is going on and on. I mean, so I'll just take a tiny passage. And at the end, and when I read the Bible, because I've read it for a long time, we find that Ezekiel 13, verse 17, Corinthians 13, verse 34, up to 38, Timothy 1 Timothy 2, verse 11, Revelation 2, verse 19, 1 Timothy 2, verse 8. And finally, the interviewer says, you really have all these passages memorized. Basically, you're not just throwing out numbers here. You really know what. The guy says, yes, yes. Every passage shows just what I'm saying. So, I mean, here is a guy who rejected his church because he actually is committed enough that he will believe only if he himself can really assure himself that he is doing what the Bible says, and he is planning to go back once he has resolved all his questions and figure out, okay, so I just want to show you a couple of visuals here. This is a roadside mosque, very typical. Most of them are identical looking. There's this type, which are the more recent ones, I think financed either by the Emiratis or the Saudis, and there's an earlier type that are blue and white with a little blue trim, but they're very, very standard architecture, no variation basically at all. And notice that it has no sign and no name. It's obviously a mosque because of the little minaret-like towers, but otherwise it doesn't have a distinctive name. This is just a roadside sign, but very typical. There are thousands of these anywhere you go. Pentecostal Power Church. Come to me and be saved. Jesus Christ saving and healing ministry. Come and receive your miracle. Matthews, I love it, they don't say Matthew, they say Matthews, 11:28. And there are the services and that's just one of many, many such things. And again, even a more ordinary church, this is just a little church, not too dissimilar from the mosque, although built by its own members and with its own distinctive architecture. Zambezi Evangelical Church, this is just meant for you to see that there's a sign that tells you the name of the church. And this, although I managed to get some text in there that isn't supposed to be there, this is the women's group at the Assemblies of God dancing during the service when they are raising money for the pastor. So this is, again, a very, very typical scene. I've seen things like this again and again. I just, last seconds here, there are many ways to explain the difference. Some fit the market model of denominational competition. Basically, the mosques don't have to compete in the same way that the many, many, many Christian denominations do. There are starting to be multiple Muslim denominations, and that may, in fact, lead to greater competition. It's possible. So there were always what's called Qadriya Islam, which is actually a Malawian version of very modest, very moderate Islam. It's Sufi in origin. Now the Saudi money has led a number of sheikhs to be trained in a more rigorous Islam, which is called Sukuti there, but it's not quite Salafist, and nobody in Malawi is going to get militant about anything, I don't think, anytime soon. Of course, the external financing means that it's like state churches, people get in the habit of not supporting their local religious institutions, the sacramental versus personal religious benefits, and finally, of course, the ones that offer healing and prophecy have a huge advantage. My last set of thoughts is just that the consequences of all this for collective action, and here's where I'm just on completely speculative ground, are that I think that it is more normal for, I haven't said this, for people to go to a mosque in or near their own village with the same people they see all the time. But that's partly because going to the mosque wouldn't be a way of making new social connections. Going to the market, you would make new social connections. Going to town, going to visit your sister in another village. All those would be ways of meeting people you didn't know before, chatting with someone on the roadside. But going to the mosque wouldn't be an especially valuable way to make the kinds of deep connections that would lead to potential help or exchange. And so I think the mosques do not tie people to the wider world in as complete a way as the churches do. And I think that, of course, there's much more mobilization of these Christian congregational communities for collective goods that serve mainly the congregation itself, although these congregations do things like visit the sick in the hospital and visit prisoners, which actually is a life and death matter, since the prisons don't typically provide food, among other things. You can starve to death there. So I'm just going to leave it there. Thank you very much. Yes, if people have questions, apparently people are going to be storming into this room after 5, but we have some time if people have questions. I'd love to answer them. Yes?
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
you share the complementarity of the authorities, right? But if you think about examples of countries without separation of church and state, sometimes there's an issue of venue shopping, right? I mean, so that if you want to resolve a dispute with the family, you go to the chief of the wife, you go to the chief of the husband, you go to the pastor. So isn't there also actually competition that leads to dysfunctionality?
There sure ought to be. Yes, I mean, I think that's an extremely, so that's what I was saying about this case of divorce, that you're right, that could that man have gone to a sheikh and gotten the sheikh to agree, or could he have gone to the chief of his home village and gotten the chief of his home village to rule in his favor? But I guess what I would say is that these informal linkages among the different authorities might determine where they could cooperate. That is, if this intuition about status is right, then it's not like here where, in my own family biography, we're Jewish, but my son married a non-Jewish woman, and so we found a Reform rabbi who would agree to marry them, and he's not going to lose status. He's a Reform rabbi. Nobody even knows him. Whereas I think a pastor or a sheikh who agreed to have someone divorce, who the chief had said you cannot divorce, that would be an extremely status-losing proposition for that person, I think. But that would be true only where there is this informal network of cooperation, and so really that's again the question of when does the effective authority of these people get reinforced by their involvement in these complex networks. And when you're absolutely right, I'll tell you the original thing I think that sparked this whole line of interest. I was staying with Susan Watkins, I should mention her, my wonderful colleague and collaborator on the book. And there was a training there run by an NGO that was sponsored by the Evangelical Association of Malawi with money from the Norwegian government. And it was an unusually long training. And we were enthralled by this because, for whatever reason, the people in this training had gorgeous voices. And as typical with these HID trainings, they prayed every morning and they sang hymns, and then they prayed every evening and they sang hymns. And we would come out of our little cubicles and just be swept away by this gorgeous call and response music. It was a cappella, it was just incredible. And on the last day, they really spent an hour singing, and so we had a friend who was one of the trainers. We'd gotten to know him very, very well because he was there for 10 days. And I'm still friends with him to this day. This was in 2009. And I said, wait, attending these trainings is a big privilege. You get all the meals, you get the per diems, you get all this stuff. I said, he said, the reason they're so good is because they're all the choir directors of the churches. And I said, oh my God, of course. They were actually getting a training in AIDS and early childhood education. And suddenly it dawned on me, my goodness, there are a bunch of 50-year-old men here. They're not doing early childhood, that's for sure. They were people who were, clients of the pastors of their churches, and that's how they got invited to this thing. And they were musically incredible. And so I said, wait a minute, but if you're going to implement early childhood education in the villages, you can do it only if the chief buys in. He would provide the land, he would basically tax the parents. People don't ask, but they want early childhood, that's for sure. It's definitely a very popular thing. But he would tax the parents, so whatever training they got in how to do it and also how to build public support for it, it would totally depend on the chief. And I was just mystified. So the patronage involved was going entirely via the churches and not via the chiefs. How did they expect their early childhood education to get implemented? So I never was able to pursue that, but that's exactly the question. Now, who had authority to pay? Sorry.
So you started with Mamdani and decentralized despotism, and that's a theory about how the colonial state enforced this kind of local authoritarianism, right? By giving chiefs coercive powers and the power to invoke the law, etc. And yet in your story is completely stateless.
Yes.
Right? You've got your denominations, you've got your NGOs, and you've got your chiefs, which are a local form of state, but highly decentralized. So, two questions. Is the Malawi state that non-present, which is, to me, kind of striking, because I could think of a lot of places with chiefs where the state still is a huge presence. And secondly, to what extent does this state of statelessness explain, some of the dynamics, the fluidity? Because one of the things to me that's really striking is, that people can just sort of, choose their religion.
Right.
That's really striking.
I actually think that's true. I won't say everywhere in Africa, but let me say I was giving a talk, not this talk, but this was 5 years ago or something, at a seminary. I guess I was doing the 3 forms of authority business, and at a seminary where it happened, there were a group of 5 or so Congolese Jesuits. This was at the GTU in Berkeley, and so they were studying there. And so I said very tentatively at the end, Malawians seem to choose their churches very freely. I have no idea if this happens elsewhere in Africa. And they said, oh no. And so these were, again, 5 Catholic priests. They said, oh no, it's true, even in our own families. People choose this. I have a brother who decided to be a this, and a so-and-so who decided to be a that. So I think people often imagine Africans as much more obedient than they are. And actually, they're very, I'll take a word from you today, very agentic. And this is one of the areas in which they exercise tons of agency. Now, I don't mean that you don't, a fair number of people say, oh no, I'm in the Anglican church, that's the church I was raised in, I stayed, it was the church of my parents, I've never changed. But the idea that you couldn't change, people, they do it all the time. I mean, one of our interviewers, she was Muslim, she married a Christian, she converted to Christianity, she kicked him out, and then she went back to being a Muslim, and now actually she wears a headscarf and she's gotten much more devout. So the personal autonomy people exercise in this arena, I think that's what's so interesting about it. That is, in the village arena, they are highly constrained. Not that every move they make is directly under the control of the chief. Again, the chief told us with such confidence how he doesn't allow anyone to not have a church. Well, here's this guy in his village who's since 2013, so that's for 5 years, has had no church, and chief probably doesn't even know. I mean, the guy lived, it's a big village, and probably, or the chief didn't care. So, but I think you are under a lot of constraint in the village. Both, you are under constraint not to create conflict with your neighbors. You are under constraint if you do displease the chief. You can get in very big hot water. So the few people who really run afoul of their chief, you can lose your life. I mean, that's the ultimate sanction, and it does get, one of Susan Watkins' diaries has a few cases. Chiefs also do get deposed if they really displease their villagers. So, I mean, it's a complicated give and take. But, so this question of the statelessness, this is something I am slightly worried about. So if you read Kate Baldwin's wonderful book on the importance of chiefs in Zambia, she paints a picture not dissimilar to the one I have, which is that to get any kind of collective good to actually happen, the chiefs have to be on board, they have to make it happen. They're the ones who, for example, tell their people to make the bricks that will be a crucial part of getting the school built. But they tend, her interest, because she's a political scientist, is why people vote for the member of parliament who is known to be allied with their own chief. And she says it's not because the chief forced them to vote for that person, it's because they realize that whatever benefits the MP could bring them will not happen if he's not on good terms with the chief. But yes, even that level of state presence, I just don't see it. So you do see it in routine ways. While I was there, the HSA, which is the Health Surveillance Assistant, these people are government employees. They're supposed to come once a month. And they actually seem to. They come, they vaccinate children. So this town crier went along the road and shouted, and all the children came, and he checks their health in some way and gave them, medicine or whatever. I think it's some kind of probably polio vaccine or something. But anyway, there was something he was supposed to do. He was there, he did it. And so, yes, government has a program of road maintenance, which is basically a form of welfare. So you can get, I think the poorest people in the village can get 12 days of a very, very tiny income, but it's a little bit of cash for working on the roads. But the chief decides who will actually get it. So some chiefs decide that, you know, it'll be divided up so more people will get work, but they've got only 6 days each, for example, and he picks who gets it. There are other, but as far as I can tell, like in this village, the chief desperately wants another borehole. It's a very big village. There is a different mosque at the far end of the village, and it has no well. So not only do the women at that end of the village walk many, many kilometers every day just to collect water for their families from the boreholes of another village to which they pay money, that they pay a sort of monthly fee to get water, but there's no water for that mosque for people to wash. And so he was asking me, did I know an NGO? Could I help him get development? You know, that might be also why he wanted to really entrain me, as it were. But no, I don't think he possibly, I actually asked him, I said something like, will the MP help you? And he was just like, well, the MP, he's not here. So the MPs have a tiny constituency development fund right before elections, which aren't nearly frequent enough in my view. They might distribute that around, but they're more likely to distribute it around in the form of cash payment to the ones who help them get one. Yeah.
Can you come back to the NGO, the thing that you started with? Because I'm just kind of curious about what your intuitions are about these different forms of authority are and what their implications are for the NGOs. So just in that sense, you know, that it seems more collective in the chiefs and the religious ties, and I mean the NGOs just seem like they're, where do they, yeah, where do they?
Yes.
And I have a question that ties right into that. If it's the chiefs and the religious leaders and you said the close-ways that are guiding people and
Yeah.
have authority, how do NGOs get invited in?
Oh,
And so how would
they are,
so
okay, so, yeah.
I'm talking about different.
Yes. Being able to attract an NGO would be a huge advantage from the point of view of any village because the NGOs represent money. And so the NGO is going to provide at a minimum some kind of training. It might conceivably even, you know, build something or promise to build something. Some of them build youth centers. There's even the individuals in the NGO, if they visit, like if foreigners visit, they will inevitably, someone will say, oh, my child is so sick, and the person will just give them money out of their pocket. So Westerners are regarded, and NGOs are regarded as sources of possible employment, even if they're Malawian, the Malawian staff are the ones who come. People want to be volunteers, they want to participate. But I would say that as soon as they realize that the NGO is not offering resources, or as soon as the resources stop, the NGO collapses. And I would say it's models of authority. We actually have some very good studies. I don't know if you've read this. There's a paper by Casey, Glenister, and Miguel. I think Rachel Casey and Rachel Glenister. I think they're both named Rachel, I've forgotten. But it's a fantastic paper about a 3-year-long community-driven development project run by a Norwegian NGO in 168 villages in either war-torn Sierra Leone or war-torn Liberia. I think it was Sierra Leone. The idea was that all social cohesion had collapsed and therefore they needed new institutions to rebuild the society and so forth. They randomized the villages, so they had basically 80 villages in the control condition and 80 in the experimental condition. They trained people in democratic participatory procedures. They gave them $3,000 to decide democratically how to spend on some kind of infrastructure project. They spent it successfully. They learned about how you vote and how you raise your hand and how you speak and how you debate. And women were involved, and blah, blah, blah. And then they got $17,000 more and they built a bigger infrastructure project and they were learning all these practices and so forth. And then at the end, the researchers did this brilliant, unobtrusive measure. So they did three things. They did a public goods gain, which is the usual. That's the usual minimum thing you do. How much will people, if you give them a resource and you tell them it'll be doubled if they put it in the common pot, what do they put in the common pot versus how much do they keep? The second was they left a tarp behind. And they just said, oh, here's this blue tarp, we don't need it, we're leaving it. And they just left it on the ground. And the third thing was they said, you've been so kind to us and such good hosts. We want to leave a little gift for the village. We have this box of batteries, or we have this box of little bags of salt. And they arranged it so the bags of salt were exactly equal in value to the batteries. They were the same number and they were worth the same amount. We can't give you both, but we'll leave them here and then we'll come back later in the day and you decide which one you want. That was the three. Oh, and the fourth thing was they left a voucher for they had been studying these villages for 3 years. So they left a voucher for some kind of hardware they could take to local hardware. And then they actually had people still packing up and so forth who were observing how these decisions get made. It turned out there were 0 differences between the intervention and control villages. That's interesting. No effect. No effect. 0 effect of an incredibly well-run 3-year project. Unbelievable. You should read this up. The second thing is, the really striking thing is, that almost everybody gave almost 100% to the public good. That is, it's not that people were selfish, it's that people already were involved in highly effective local institutional life. The third thing is that the tarp almost everywhere did not end up in the chief's roof, where it would be very nice to keep out the rain and you could put your thatch on top of it. It ended up being used by the village women to dry their grain in public. They dry and bleach their grain, so it was used collectively. And ditto with the, oh, and the decision about the batteries was made by the chief every single time. There was no public participation. The chief decided. So the way I interpret that is chiefs are doing a reasonable job of providing collective goods. They have a lot of authority over their people. The people, of course, I always say this to my students. I say, look, if people in Malawi could have an effective rule of law state that guaranteed that the goat that's your goat today will be your goat tomorrow, the land that's your land today will be your land tomorrow, the child that is your child today will be your child tomorrow, the spouse that is your spouse today will not be stolen by someone. And if they could have a job in a formal market economy, a formal job, they would love not to be subject to the authority of chiefs. Are you kidding me? I mean, yes, there'd be traditions, and yes, they'd worry about their ancestors. That's a big deal. They're buried, and the chief controls the burial grounds and so forth. But, I mean, no, they would love to be modern people. But this is back to Patrick's question. They don't have effective modern institutions. The formal economy is tiny. So when people move to the city and get educated and get formal employment and a generation or two, then they start to do things like, as at least some of our friends, this isn't what I study, but as you know, you inevitably draw half your anthropological insight from just your friendship circle. They say things like, yes, you know, it's very bad, I should support my parents, but the school fees for our children are so expensive. And so my brother has completely stopped. He moved to South Africa and he doesn't even come home, he doesn't even see them. I still visit my parents and I bring what I can and I visit my grandmother and blah, blah, blah. But we really should do more. I know we should. You do get that when people can enter the modern economy and the modern state in an effective way. But for most of them, they can't. And so these institutions are, in that context, incredibly effective. And I'll just say that if you look at survey data, which the Afrobarometer shows, that of how trusted and traditional authorities all across Africa are the most trusted, and MPs and things are like down at the bottom. And so you could have effective government that really mattered. I think that one thing I have not explored is what the heck the district officers actually do. They are important. They do regulate some of whatever flow of money there is from the central government, but I have not been able to study.
It just makes me laugh because I think, at what point did this group of people get together and say, would really like to be trained in democracy, and could you come and spend 3 years teaching us something? I mean, if I'm walking miles from water, I'm not asking for an NGO to
No, but
train
if
me
they
in
think
democracy.
you might have resources.
I know, I'm understanding that half of it. Very well, like, yes, I'll
Yes.
let you in because the likelihood you might stumble on something I really, really need.
It's even, so let me give you an anecdote that we use in our book. Now, I have to say Susan Watkins and Ina Kelly are just in general probably among the more cynical people you'll ever meet. So I think a genuinely good human being, which I gather you are, I'm serious, might perceive the world a little bit differently than we did, because we are very, very hard-boiled. Just, that's who we are. But we cite the work of an anthropologist in our book who has lived in a village for a year and a half. It's wonderful, and her name is Janneke Verheijsen. She's Dutch. And she wrote a book about this village, and she became very close friends with a local woman. And that local woman went every day to an adult literacy class. Even though she had learned to read as a young child, she was fully literate, she could read and write, she would pretend to write with the wrong hand in order to pretend why. She got nothing. But she thought that maybe eventually there would be a benefit. And she didn't dare not participate. She thought, there might someday be a little benefit from this. And so I think, look, the chief, I think, would be thrilled to have an NGO come. Thrilled. Yeah, go ahead.
I think we went out of time.
Yeah.
But thank you so much.
Yes, it was a pleasure.
Absolutely fascinating.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.